Chapter 7. Maggie got out of her car with some relief. It was just after 8 in the morning, and the day's heat hadn't gotten a chance to burn off the early morning fog yet. She had only had a few feet of visibility as she had driven to the Carnival site, and she was happy to be off the road. She had briefly spoken with the Carnival representative the previous evening, and she had been told that the site manager, Silvia Curioso, would meet her at the front gate. The fog made it difficult to make out the shape of the large arch. She took a moment to grab her hat out of the car and put it on before heading towards it. As she drew closer, she saw a figure standing a few feet away from the gate. She was taller than Maggie was, and a bit younger as well. Her black hair was cut short on one side and long on the other. She would have seemed more at place at a punk rock concert than a carnival. "Sheriff Grant?" the woman asked politely. "Yes, ma'am," she replied as they shook hands. "My name is Silvia Curioso. Thank you for coming so early in the morning." "No problem. I'm happy to do it. I want to thank you and the owners for going along with this inspection. I doubt that there will be any issues, but we haven't had something like this in Lamplight Woods before, and I want to do things by the book." She nodded. "I completely understand. It sounds like you and I are very much alike. Mr. Liber teases me about being too cautious and thorough, but I believe that anything worth doing is worth doing right. Where would you like to start?" Maggie shrugged. "Why don't you just give me a general tour around the carnival?" "I'd be happy to. Shall we?" They walked through the arch and into the carnival. The tents had been put close together to form a sort of path. Most of the front flaps were closed, but a few were open where laborers were working to put the finishing touches on exhibits. Up ahead, the road ended and forked off towards both the left and the right. "You have a very interesting name," Maggie commented as they walked. "I don't think that I've heard the name Curioso before." "Most people think it's a stage name, but it's actually an old family name," Curioso replied with a smile. "It's completely coincidental, but it ended up being quite appropriate for the line of work I ended up in." "I'd say so." She looked around. "So what am I looking at here?" "This is the front of the carnival. We refer to it as the main drag. The ticket window is next to the entryway, and beyond that on the right, you'll find places to buy food, souvenirs, and other such things. That's also where the local business booths will be set up. On your left are your standard carnival games: ring toss, basketball shooting, filling balloons with water from stationary water guns, that sort of thing." "So pretty standard stuff, then." She nodded. "Exactly. We'll head down the left path first." They continued in the direction that she indicated. There were still tents on the outside perimeter, but the space that divided the two walking paths was a large circular structure constructed of wood and metal. "Here's where things get a bit more, shall we say, exotic," Curioso told her. "You'll notice that the tents on our left are larger than the ones in the entrance area. They're made to house a number of our signature attractions. The troupe refers to themselves as freaks, but I don't personally like that term. It harkens back to a time when carnivals and circuses would parade around people with medical conditions or deformities. It was a disgusting practice, and we don't stand for it here." "Good to hear," Maggie said approvingly. "What kind of exhibits do you use instead?" "A wide variety, actually. We find people with talents and encourage them to be extremely creative with those talents. Each of the tents has been designed and decorated by the person or persons occupying it. We want the entire attraction to reflect who they are." "That's very interesting. It really is, but it doesn't answer my question." She smiled slightly. "No, I suppose that it doesn't. You'll have to excuse me. I'm rather proud of how we've modernized the carnival experience. I tend to get a bit preachy about it. To answer your question, we have a wide variety of exhibits. We have twin contortionists, a man who combines sword and fire eating, a fortune teller, a mind reader, and many more. I really shouldn't show favoritism as a manager, but just between you and me, I personally enjoy Lisbeth Erickson, the Ice Queen." The path they were on gently curved to the right as they walked, creating a half circle around the center building. Maggie kept an eye out for open tent flaps that would allow her to see inside one of the exhibits, but they were all closed. She wasn't surprised. It was still early in the morning, and most of the performers were probably still asleep. They had a busy night ahead of them. They reached the far side of the round building. Curioso came to a stop at its entrance. If we had gone right instead of left at the entryway, this is where that path would meet the one that we did take, she explained. And each side has a series of exhibits and attractions? Maggie asked. Yes, exactly. The paths meet here, and the building we're standing in front of is one of our feature presentations. A fully operational theater with performances by truly talented actors. She opened one of the double wooden doors and held it for her. Maggie nodded her thanks and went inside, Curioso following closely behind. A stage had been set up at the far end of the building, and rows of chairs had been placed in front of it. A crew of workers were assembling a background display at the rear of the stage. Tonight our performers will be putting on a true classic for the people of Lamplight Woods, Curioso said. They'll be performing The Tragic History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. Are you familiar with it? It's the one about the man that makes a deal with the devil, isn't it? Maggie answered after a moment's thought. Correct. It's the story of Dr. Faustus, a man that summons the demon Mephistopheles and makes an unholy bargain. Not exactly the most family-friendly story. No, it certainly isn't. The Carnival has something for everyone, however, and I would argue that in this day and age, the overall message of the play is more relevant than ever. Besides, only adults will be admitted into the showings. Shall we continue on? The woman led the way back out of the building. There was a short path that led further into the field before the area opened up significantly. The large crimson and black Ferris wheel was directly in front of them, and further beyond it she could make out the shape of the roller coaster even through the fog. There were also a few other rides and buildings scattered around the area. This is our Ferris wheel, of course, Curioso told her. The roller coaster in the back is called Ex Oblivion. The ride to the left of the Ferris wheel is the Icurian. It's a more rare design. The cars spin around the center wheel, and once they've reached their maximum speed, the wheel is raised up to a steep angle. It's really quite thrilling. It sounds like it, Maggie agreed. I've always enjoyed thrill rides. I've loved them ever since my father took me to Cedar Point for my 8th birthday. My wife is much more into them, though. She can't get enough of them. It's funny that you mentioned Cedar Point, as at one point it had a very similar ride to Icurian called the Witch's Wheel. Icurian goes faster and has a slightly steeper angle when raised. I'll have to give it a try. What are the other structures? There's an old-fashioned carousel, a fun house, a chair swing ride, a haunted house, and a few others. Oh, and there's a second stage just beyond the Ferris wheel for live performances. It's well outside the recommended distance from any of the equipment, of course. Of course. Well, I have to say, it looks like you've got everything worked out here, Miss Curioso. I've been at this for a while, Sheriff Grant, the woman said with a smile. I may not know everything, but the one thing I do know is how to run a carnival. Chapter 8. Michael had just finished screwing a shelf into the wall when there was a knock at the front door. He set down the drill and glanced over at the corner of the room that Mira had been napping in. The creature was already gone, having teleported into another part of the house where it wouldn't be seen. The shipments that he had been expecting had arrived earlier that morning. They had been boxed up in large crates that didn't fit through the doorways, so he had asked the delivery driver to leave them in the driveway near the detached garage. They would have to sit there until he got finished building the necessary shelving. He walked through the dining room and into the main store. He had no idea who the visitor was. The store wasn't scheduled to open until the following Monday, and the only visitor that he got on a regular basis was Maggie. If it had been her, she would have come in without announcing her presence like she always did. He reached the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was a man in a black pinstripe suit and a flat cap. It was Leonard Liber, the man from the carnival that Michael had seen in front of City Hall a few days earlier. "Good morning to you, sir," Liber said brightly, a broad grin on his face. Good morning, Michael replied politely, trying to keep the confusion out of his voice. I apologize for the intrusion. I'd hoped to come during your regular business hours, but I didn't see them posted anywhere. Forgotten Tales isn't actually open currently. The reopening is planned for next week. The grin fell from Liber's face. Oh, I see. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm a visitor from out of town, you see, and I make it a habit to visit the various pawn shops and antique stores in each town I go to. It's something of a hobby of mine. Michael wasn't sure what to say, so he simply went with, I see. I'm only in town until Saturday, however, so I won't be able to be here when your fine-looking business is open. I don't suppose you wouldn't consider one early customer, would you, given the circumstances? Michael hesitated. He didn't know anything about Liber, with the exception that he was one of the owners of the Carnival visiting Lamplight Woods, and he really had no reason to be accommodating. On the other hand, he was a local business owner now, and there wasn't really any harm to it. Coming to a decision, he nodded. Sure, why not, he said, opening the door wider and stepping out of the way so that Liber could enter. I don't mind inviting you in for a few minutes. I very much appreciate it, Liber said, the smile returning as he entered Forgotten Tales. I hope that it's no imposition. No, it's fine. The store isn't fully stocked and there's some dust from the new shelving I'm building, though. I completely understand. He began to slowly walk around the store, carefully examining every item as he went. You have a fine store here, Mr. Dyer. If I may ask, why are you currently closed? A few of your fellow townsfolk made it sound like Forgotten Tales has been operating for quite some time. Michael nodded. I'm the third generation of Dyers to own it. My father died recently, and he hadn't been able to take care of the store properly over the past few years. I've been getting things put back together and updated since I got back to town. I'm sorry to hear about your father's passing. Thank you. Liber stopped in front of a glass case and leaned forward to get a better look. Michael had displayed a number of fragile objects inside of it, and he wondered which of them had caught the unexpected customer's attention. He started to ask, but the man turned slightly as he pointed. May I get a better look at this music box, please? Liber asked. Michael went over to the counter and retrieved a set of keys on a ring from a hook. He flipped through them until he found the correct one and used it to unlock the display case. Putting the keys in his pocket, he carefully lifted the antique music box out and gently placed it onto the counter. Exquisite, Liber said in a voice barely above a whisper. The music box was round instead of the more common rectangular shape. It was black with gold and silver wrapping shaped like leaves and vines. The four legs at the bottom were also made of gold. Liber reached out with both hands and slowly opened the top. A painting of a man and a woman dancing in front of a Christmas tree adorned the inside of the lid. A small figurine shaped like a ballet dancer stood in the center, her arms held out in front of her and one leg stretched out behind her. Exquisite, Liber said again. Do you know what you have here, Mr. Dyer? It's an antique music box from early 20th century Russia, Michael replied, trying to recall the notes he had taken when he was researching it. It was clearly made for one of the few wealthy families remaining in the country at the time. At that point, Russia as a whole was extremely impoverished, so much that it led to the Russian Revolution of 1917. You know your history, the man said approvingly. Do you happen to know which family commissioned this piece? I don't, no. I've been looking into it during my free time, but I haven't been able to track down that part of the story. Then consider yourself lucky to have met me, Mr. Dyer, because I happen to have that answer. The two people dancing the portrait are Anatole and Marie van der Pollen, the parents of the esteemed astronomer Emanuel van der Pollen. This music box was commissioned by them for their daughter Helen when she was a young child. Michael blinked. It was? Indeed. This is a piece of history that you have here, albeit a small footnote rather than a truly noteworthy piece. How much are you selling it for? Since it's missing the key and there are a number of scratches, I've got it priced at $275. A fair price. I'll take it. Michael reached under the counter and produced a small cardboard box and a stack of packing paper. He carefully set the music box down on the paper and wrapped it inside before putting it all inside of the box. He shut the top and sealed it with a piece of tape. Liber retrieved his wallet from his pocket. He opened it and fished out $300 bills. He set them down the counter and picked up the box. "Tell me, Mr. Dyer," he said, "do you plan on attending our carnival this weekend?" "I'm going to try to make it," Michael said, putting the money into the cash register and giving his unexpected customer the proper change. "I hadn't expected all of my shipments to come in on the exact same day, so I'm running behind on getting things set up for Monday." Liber nodded. "The burdens of being a businessman. Thank you for the music box. I have the perfect place in my collection for it." The man turned and walked through the store to the front door. He reached out and put his hand on the knob. Instead of opening the door, however, he turned his head back. "That was an interesting way of inviting me into your store," Liber said, an odd tone in his voice. "Sorry?" Michael asked, not sure what the man meant. "You said it in a very peculiar way. You said that you were inviting me in for a few minutes. Most people would say that I was welcome to come in, or just to come in. You stated that I was invited in for a short time." "I suppose that I did. I'm not sure that You said it deliberately in such a way as to limit my time here if I was a certain type of, say, creature in disguise," Liber stated calmly. "Vampires can only come into a residence if they're invited, for example. There are a number of other beings that have the same restriction, although they aren't as well known in popular culture. Did you know that succubi have to be invited in as well?" Michael didn't say anything. He stared at the man as he made sure to keep his face blank. He didn't know how this man knew about such things, but he wasn't going to let on that it had him rattled. Besides, someone having that type of knowledge didn't automatically make them sinister. It just meant that they had a rather rare education. "Well then, I'll be going," Liber said, opening the door. "There's a lot to attend to before this evening. You really should come by the carnival, Mr. Dyer. I can promise you that a man such as yourself would find it fascinating." Chapter 9. Sarah barely said anything as she wolfed down her dinner. While she had been at school, it had seemed like time was barely moving, but now that she was home, it felt more like it had sped up. She could feel her father watching her in what could best be described as a mixture of amusement and disgust as she shoveled the food into her mouth, but she didn't care. There was just over an hour before the carnival opened, and she wanted to make sure that she was there when it did. "Is Josh picking you up?" her father asked. "Sort of," she replied between bites. "He's driving over, but we're going to ride our bikes into town. We figured that it would be hard to find a parking space." "Good idea. If you want, I can drop the two of you off so that you don't have to worry about the bikes. You can just call me when you're ready to be picked up." "Thanks, but we've got it covered. Sheriff Grant's dad told us that we can put our bikes into the split log storage room. Plus, well..." He made a face. Yeah, I know. Your dad is embarrassing and weird, and you don't want him anywhere near you." She smiled. "Oh, good. You do understand. Just do me a favor, okay? Be careful and stay safe while you're there." "We will, Dad." There was something about the way that he had asked that sounded a little off. "Is something wrong?" He visibly hesitated. "No, nothing's wrong. I just met one of the owners of the carnival today, and it was an odd conversation. Nothing bad, just odd." "Don't worry, Dad," Sarah reassured him. "I promise to be careful." "I know you will. Besides, Maggie will be there keeping an eye on things. If you need immediate help, you can call her." "Are you sure that you don't want to go? Pretty much everyone in Lamplight Woods is going to be there tonight." He smiled slightly. "It's not a matter of wanting. I've still got work to do setting up things for the opening. I need to do a bit more tonight and then get some sleep so that I can finish up tomorrow. Sarah suddenly felt a stab of guilt. I can stay and help if you need me. Her father shook his head. No, you go and have fun. Are you sure? I'm sure. Besides, you're dressed up all fancy for it. Sarah glanced down at her outfit. Since the carnival had a horror theme to it, she and Josh had decided to dress for the occasion. After a long internal deliberation, she decided on one of her favorite horror movie characters. She is now wearing the iconic leather jacket, dark shirt, and jeans of Alice Johnson from the fourth Nightmare on Elm Street film. It's not like I would be able to stop a dream warrior from going somewhere even if I tried anyway, he said with a crooked smile. 10 minutes later, Sarah was out of the house and rummaging around in the garage. Her bike was right at the front of the boxes and shelves that her father had stored inside, but the detachable light for the bike wasn't where she had left it. She didn't want to be riding around the town's back roads in pitch-black darkness. She found the box on the garage floor in one of the corners. It must have accidentally gotten knocked off its shelf when the other things had been pushed into it. She was relieved to find that it was still in one piece when she opened the box. Retrieving a screwdriver from a toolbox, she quickly attached it to the front of the bike. The bright white light worked perfectly when she turned it on, so she switched it back off to conserve the battery. There was the sound of a car coming up the gravel driveway behind her. She turned in time to see Josh park his car and get out. He undid the straps holding his bike to the car's roof and carefully pulled it down. She nodded in approval at his costume. They hadn't discussed what they would be dressed as ahead of time, so she hadn't known who or what he was going to be. He had apparently decided on Sheriff Martin Brody from Jaws, specifically the outfit the character had worn while in the ill-fated Orca. All that was missing was a lit cigarette in his mouth. You ready? Josh asked as he walked his bike over to her. Just finished, Sarah replied, reaching up and pulling down the garage door. Let's go. They headed out. The sun was starting to set in the distance, but there was still plenty of light to see by. At first they didn't need to contend with any traffic. The closer they got to downtown, though, the more cars they started to see. By the time they arrived, they were riding past a long stopped line of traffic. I'm very glad that we didn't bring the car, Josh commented as they got off their bikes in front of the split log. No kidding, Sarah said with a nod. I didn't know that there were this many cars in all of Lamplight Woods. Well, it looks like pretty much every single one of them is here. They wheeled their bikes through the open door of the bar. Standing behind the counter was an old man with white hair and a beard. He looked up as they came inside and smiled. Good evening, Miss Dyer and Mr. Taylor, Martin Grant greeted them. Are you enjoying the first ever traffic jam in the history of Lamplight Woods? Good evening, Mr. Grant, Sarah said politely. There's quite a crowd out there. You're not kidding. It's like the Rolling Stones have come to town. He smiled. Well, maybe that's an exaggeration. Traffic is much worse at a Stones concert. You seen the Rolling Stones live? Josh asked as the man led them to the back of the bar. 3 times. In fact, I saw them last year in Philadelphia at Lincoln Financial Field. I'm old, Josh, not dead. They put their bikes into the storage room, making sure that they were out of the way. Returned to the main bar area, they found Sheriff Grant and her wife Jenny standing just inside the doorway. The sheriff wasn't dressed in her full uniform, but she was wearing a black shirt with yellow writing that read Sheriff on the front pocket and across the back. Her duty belt was also fastened around her waist. I didn't realize that you had guests, Dad, Sheriff Grant said to her father. I see you're in it as thick as thieves with Sarah and Josh here. Oh, you know me, Grant said with a wink. Always interested in helping raise the next generation of anarchists. It won't be long before I let them in on my multinational cocaine operation, and we kick the law enforcement out of town so that we can take it over for ourselves. Interesting. Seeing as how I am the town's law enforcement, you're saying that you're working to get your own daughter kicked out of town. So is there some sort of sign-up sheet for this anarchist thing? Jenny asked as she fought back a grin. Or should I come back after I ditch the fuzz here? Oh, I see how it is. They continued to tease each other, but Sarah's attention was caught by something outside the bar window. She walked over to it and peered out through the glass. There was some sort of commotion on the other side of the street. She couldn't tell what was happening with all the cars in the way. She slipped out the door. Josh was close behind her. Together they walked a short distance down the sidewalk until they were able to see between the cars. It took her a moment to comprehend what she was seeing. A group of people in black robes were walking down the opposite sidewalk. All of their hoods were pulled up over their heads, and they're all carrying a lit wooden torch. They walked in single file, and although it was difficult to hear over the noise of the traffic and bystanders, it sounded like they were chanting something. She shook her head. That wasn't right. They were actually humming in a low, almost guttural tone. The procession was headed directly towards the field where the carnival was located. All of the town residents nearby were watching the cloaked figures in fascination. Everyone grew quiet, and the humming could more easily be heard. Without realizing that she was doing it, Sarah crossed the street and followed them as they went over the small bridge spanning the river. A crowd was already gathered in front of the carnival gates. The entire carnival beyond them was dark. She couldn't see a single light coming from inside. Sarah checked her phone and saw that it was only 10 minutes until 7. As the torchbearers approached, the crowd parted to allow them through. They went directly to the gate and lined up across the entrance, their torches held out towards the people. "Ladies and gentlemen," a booming voice said from behind the cloaked people, "my name is Leonard Liber." A man in a black suit stepped out of the shadows and took his place in front of the torchbearers. A top hat was perched on his head, and he reached up to remove it as he bowed dramatically to the assembled townspeople. He tucked it under his arm and smiled. "Tonight is the night that all of your lives change," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly to everyone gathered. "As we celebrate this darkest of seasons, the celebration of the season of Samhain, you will all experience something the likes of which you've never experienced. You will be changed by it, and perhaps, just perhaps, it will be changed by you." One of the torchbearers stepped forward while pulling down their hood. Sarah immediately recognized the black hair of Silvia Curioso, the woman that had spoken to her the previous evening. She handed her torch to Liber and proceeded to remove her robe. She was wearing a long black Victorian dress, the kind that women would wear to funerals during that time period. The dark cloth and lace flowed gracefully as she moved. "Once our gates are open, they will not close again until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning," Liber continued. "The celebration will continue all through the night and into the deepest, darkest parts of the morning. At 10 o'clock sharp, all children under the age of 13 will be sent along their way to return to their dreams. The true celebration will then begin. It is then that we will truly be at your service, people of Lamplight Woods." Curioso raised her arm above her head and snapped her fingers. All of the torches suddenly turned blood red before erupting upward into the sky. She snapped her fingers again, and the fires all extinguished. At the same moment, the carnival behind her came to life. The lights all turned on simultaneously, and music began to play through a hidden speaker system. The giant Ferris wheel started turning in the distance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Liber said slowly, "welcome to Maestru and Liber's Carnival of Wonders and Horrors." Chapter 10. Maggie watched as the crowd began to move through the front gate of the carnival. She wasn't sure how to feel about the spectacle that she had just witnessed. On the one hand, it violated a number of fire and criminal codes, but on the other hand, it had been a hell of a show. She sighed. No one had been hurt, so she would just let it go. She had decided earlier in the day that she was going to let minor things slide during the carnival anyway. It would be good for the people of Lamplight Woods to be able to blow off some steam. So tell me, Sheriff Grant, Jenny said with mock seriousness, are you just going to let these people get away with carrying open torches in a public area? I swear you know me too well, Meg replied with a smile. I was just thinking about that. What conclusion did you come to? I've decided to relax and just go with the flow. I'm available to help with anything serious or potentially dangerous, but beyond that, I'm just going to go with the flow. Jenny tilted her head slightly and looped her arm through Maggie's. I think I believe you a bit less every time you use the phrase go with the flow, but I also think it's a very good plan. It will leave you plenty of time to have fun with your loving, and might I add also beautiful, wife. Yeah, it's been a while, hasn't it? It has. Jenny paused. Listen, Maggie, it's been a rough few months for both of us, and I know that it's at least partially my fault. Maggie shook her head. No, I completely get it. Stop. Just listen to me, okay? I'm trying to get past it. I really am. I just want you to know that I will get past it, and that this is where I want to be, and you're the one I want to be with. Okay? That is more than okay. Let's just have some fun tonight like we used to. Hopefully nothing comes up that needs me. Jenny kissed her. I knew what I was signing up for when I married a sheriff. Let's go inside. I have had a huge craving for cotton candy ever since I heard this was going to be a thing. They got in line to purchase tickets. The large arch that marked the front gate towered over the crowd as it moved slowly forward. It was painted with a red stripe along the outside of the arch and a black stripe along the inside. It looked a bit like a mouth getting ready to devour the people walking through. What do you suppose the horror part of Carnival of Wonders and Horrors is referring to? Jenny asked. I talked to Curioso about that this morning, Maggie told her. She said that part of what they do to make their carnival unique is they treat it like it's Halloween every night. Some of the carnies dress up in costumes, and there are a lot of attractions that have horror themes. There are a lot of children here. Hopefully it's not too intense in there for them. Maggie raised an eyebrow. For them or for you? Don't forget, I was there the first time that you watched The Exorcist. Jenny playfully punched her in the arm. Oh, stop. You know what I'm getting at. Yeah, I get it. The attractions meant for adults are clearly marked, and everywhere in the open is designed to be okay for kids. Until it's time for them to leave, anyway. They arrived at the ticket window, and Maggie reached for her wallet. Before she could pay for the tickets, however, a woman stepped out of the shadows near the booth. It was Curioso, still wearing her black dress from the carnival opening. Good evening, Sheriff Grant, the woman greeted her pleasantly. Evening, Miss Curioso, she replied with a nod. Looks like you've got quite the turnout here. It does indeed. We're thrilled that so many people turned up for opening night. She turned to the person working the ticket booth. Sheriff Grant and her companion won't be needing tickets, Harold. They'll be here as my guests. Oh, thank you, Miss Curioso, Maggie said as she and Jenny stepped out of line. We appreciate that. The dark-haired woman shook her head. Think nothing of it. I'm the one that's appreciative. You made the inspection process much less painful than most local law enforcement does, and for that I'm grateful. It was a pleasure to work with a true professional for once. You made something less irritating? Jenny asked with mock surprise. Curioso chuckled. You must be Sheriff Grant's wife. I'm Sylvia Curioso. It's a pleasure to meet you. Jenny Grant. This carnival is really impressive, Miss Curioso. We're proud of it. It took many years and a lot of hard work, but it's been worth it. She sighed. Well, if you'll excuse me, I've got to be getting back to it. There's always something that wants to go wrong no matter how many opening nights we have. If you need anything at all, just ask one of our staff, and they'll get in touch with me. Curioso walked into the carnival and quickly spoke to the person collecting tickets. She pointed over at Maggie and Jenny while she spoke, and the carny nodded. The site manager patted the man on the shoulder before continuing further into the carnival and disappearing behind a tent. She seems nice, Jenny commented as the ticket taker waved them through the gate. Yeah, Maggie responded slowly. Nice. There was something about the woman that made her wary. Curioso hadn't said anything to get that kind of reaction from her. She hadn't seen anything during her inspection that had sounded any warning bells either. She shook her head slightly. She was pretty sure that it had to do with the very deliberate way that Curioso spoke. It was very businesslike, much the way that Mayor Dilfer spoke. That was it, she decided. It was the Dilfer-like way of speaking that she had. Through no fault of her own, she evoked thoughts of someone that Maggie disliked. She would have to be sure not to let that personal bias show through. It wasn't fair to Curioso, as she had been nothing but nice and accommodating. Directly inside the gate to the right was a line of food booths. Jenny immediately made a beeline towards the booth selling cotton candy. Maggie watched in amusement as she happily ordered the largest one available. Her own stomach chose that moment to rumble. It had been a long time since lunch. Rather than make a meal out of dessert foods like Jenny, however, Maggie went over to a booth offering fried pierogies. It had been years since she had eaten pierogies. She thanked the person working the booth and took a bite of one of them. She closed her eyes and smiled. It tasted very much like the ones her mother used to make when she was little. She could almost hear the woman's humming as she worked in the kitchen. We're only 20 feet inside the gate, and I already love this place, Jenny proclaimed as she attempted to maneuver a piece of cotton candy twice the size of her head. I'm never leaving if they have funnel cakes. They'll just have to transport me from town to town. There's a sign for them right over there, Maggie told her, motioning with her chin. It's next to the apple cider. Well, there goes my career in nursing. I'm running away to join the circus. Chapter 11. Sarah and Josh slowly made their way through the opening area of the carnival. Her eyes darted from place to place as they walked, trying to take in as much as possible. They had already passed through the food and souvenir vendors, and they arrived at a fork in the path. It looks like both ways go around this tent in the middle, Josh observed. Which way do you want to go? There doesn't seem to be much of a difference, Sarah noted. Why don't we go right? It looks a little less crowded that way. There were quite a few tents lined up along the right side of the path. Some of the tent flaps were open, revealing the rooms and performers within, but many of the flaps were closed with only small signs standing next to the tents to give any indication as to what was inside. The first one they passed was open, and she could see a thin man performing for a small group gathered around him. She couldn't be sure because of the view being mostly blocked by observers, but she was pretty sure that he was doing a handstand using just his fingertips. The next tent was also open. Inside, a group of children were seated on the ground as they watched an elderly woman perform a puppet show. These were the older marionette-style puppets rather than the more modern type, and she made them dance with precise movements of her hands. The children were mesmerized by the show. The flap of the third tent was closed. There was a small sign staked in the ground on the right side. Sarah moved towards it and out of the way of the crowd moving up and down the path. The sign read, House of Ceromancy. She looked back at Josh, and he returned her gaze with a shrug. Turning back to the tent, she pulled open the flap and went inside. Josh followed closely behind and let the flap fall shut. The noise from the crowd outside instantly dropped to a dull hum. The inside of the tent was bright white. Her first instinct was that the glow came from the bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Once her eyes adjusted, she realized that the floors, walls, and roof were all colored white. She reached out and touched the tent wall. Her fingers slid across something smooth. The entire inside of the tent, both the tent itself and the table and chairs in the center, were coated in a thin layer of wax. Sitting on the opposite side of the table, dressed in one of the black robes she had seen in the torchbearer procession in the street, and her face and hands wrapped in bandages, was a dark-haired woman. Good evening, the woman said in a perfectly calm voice. Welcome to the House of Ceromancy. My name is Madame Lenora. Please, come sit. Sarah and Josh exchanged a glance before going over to the wax-covered chairs and sitting down. The woman watched them silently as they did so, her face expressionless. She was welcoming, but also somehow cold and distant. "So, tell me, why have you come this evening?" Lenora asked, folding her hands together as she spoke. "We just kind of wandered in," Sarah answered. "We saw the sign outside and got curious." The woman nodded once. "Ah, I see. A chance encounter. Or perhaps not so much chance as providence? We shall see." "What exactly is ceromancy?" Josh asked. "I don't think I've ever heard of it before." "I would be very surprised if you had." The woman reached under the table and took out a wide wooden bowl with a tall candle in the center. "Ceromancy is the ancient art of telling the future through wax and flame. Very few people have the gift. Would you like to know what the future holds for you?" He shrugged. "Yeah, sure, why not?" "Excellent. Fortune favors the bold. Let us first settle the matter of payment." "Oh, right. How much?" he asked, reaching for his wallet. "I don't require monetary compensation," she replied. "All that I require is for your companion to answer a few questions for me." "What questions?" Sarah asked suspiciously. The woman smiled slightly, although there didn't seem to be any warmth behind it. "Nothing of any questionable nature," Lenora assured her. "Silvia Curioso pointed you out to me during the opening ceremony, and she mentioned that you are Sarah Dyer. Your father owns an antique store here in town, does he not?" "Well, yes," Sarah replied. "I thought so. There's something that I've been searching for, and I haven't been able to find it in any of the towns and cities that we've visited. I wonder if maybe you've seen this particular object in your father's store, or perhaps in his personal collection." "Oh," she couldn't think of anything else to say to that. "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for a specific key. It's attached to a red diamond-shaped keychain with the words Blackwood Lodge engraved on it. Is your father in possession of such a key?" Sarah felt her blood go cold in her veins. This woman knew about the lodge key. She forced herself to remain calm and not show any outward indication that she had been caught by surprise. "I'm afraid not," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice was. "Sorry." The woman watched her closely for a moment. Sarah was sure that she'd be called out for a lie. Instead, though, she simply nodded once. "Well, it was worth a try," Lenora said with a shrug. "Now then, young man, place the fingertips of both hands on the rim of the bowl." Josh complied, sneaking a quick glance at Sarah as he did so. The woman lit the candle in the center of the bowl and watched carefully as the flame began to melt the wax. Drops slowly ran down the sides. "The future is always a product of the past," Lenora told him. "To see your future, you must first look into what has come before. The flame shows me that your childhood was ended before its natural time. Its thread was cut with violence and loss." Sarah quickly turned towards Josh. His jaw was clenched tightly. His mother had suffered from severe mental issues, and when he was 8, she had murdered his father before taking her own life during an episode. "A tragic and horrible loss," Lenora continued. "One that you not only felt, but also witnessed." "How do you know that?" Josh asked in a choked voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes widened. He had told her about his parents' deaths, but he hadn't said anything about watching them happen. His face was pale, and his expression made it clear that he was reliving the memory. "I know, because the flame and wax know," Lenora said. "Now, watch as it moves down the candle and takes shape in the bowl." A large glob of wax bubbled over the top of the candle and slowly ran down the side. As it reached the bottom, 2 more followed closely behind. More and more wax melted into the same exact spot. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. Something was forming in the wax as it cooled. She sucked in her breath. The wax was rapidly creating a highly detailed sculpture. It depicted a man standing over a woman, a large axe gripped in his hands and raised over his head. The woman was holding her hands out in front of her as if she was pleading for her life. The faces took shape, and she watched as they revealed that it was Josh standing over her. "Oh my," Lenora said with a wicked smile. "It would appear that not only were you born in blood, but that you're also destined to shed it." Josh pushed himself off of his chair and ran out of the tent. Chapter 12. Sarah caught up to Josh further down the path. He was standing in a small area between 2 of the tents, his back turned to the crowd as he leaned against a section of fencing. His head was down, and he was taking long, slow breaths. "Are you okay?" she demanded, not even trying to mask the worry in her voice. He didn't answer. She tried to move around him slightly to see his face, but he turned away. Not sure what else to do, she took his hand in hers and waited. "She can't be right," Josh said finally. "I wouldn't do that. I couldn't do that." "Of course she's not right," Sarah stated firmly. "You would never do anything to hurt me. That was, well, I don't know what that was, but it wasn't showing the future. It was just some trick." He shook his head but didn't say anything. "Hey, Josh, look at me," she said. "Please." He turned his face towards her. His eyes had a haunted look, and he appeared to be on the verge of being sick. "That back there was bullshit," she said firmly. "It was some sort of trick. Remember that this is supposed to be a carnival of wonders and horrors. We just went into one of the horror exhibits without knowing it." "It's my worst fear," Josh told her quietly, "that I'll end up the same way that she was." "Like who?" "My mother. She was the most gentle and loving person in the world until something snapped in her. Something in her just broke one day, and it was never the same. We thought that she was getting better, but then she—" He trailed off. Sarah wanted to say something to him, to reassure him that everything would be fine, but she didn't. She understood what he was telling her, and more importantly, she understood what he wasn't saying. He was terrified that the mental disorders that had afflicted his mother were hereditary, and one day, his mind would break just like hers had. "Hey, let's get out of here," she said with a small smile. "Let's go back to my place and watch a movie or something." "No, I'm okay," Josh said as he straightened back up and took a final deep breath. "We can stay." She looked at him closely. "Are you sure? I really don't mind if we—" "Would you fucking please stop mothering me?" he snapped. "I'm sure. Let's keep going." "I'm not trying to mother you, Josh. I'm just worried about you." "Save your worry for someone who actually wants it." Sarah felt like she had been slapped. He had never spoken to her this way before, and if she hadn't heard it come out of his mouth herself, she wouldn't have believed it. He was looking at her with anger and disgust. "You know what?" she said as she gathered herself. "Fuck you." She turned on her heel and marched back towards the front of the carnival. She gritted her teeth as she pushed through the crowd moving in the opposite direction that she was. Her temper was flaring, but she also felt like she was suffering from an emotional punch to the gut. She couldn't tell if she wanted to hit something or break down crying. She was so occupied with her own thoughts that she wasn't watching where she was going. She collided with someone directly in front of her. It was hard enough to nearly knock her off her feet, but at the last second a hand reached out and grabbed her arm to steady her. "Sarah?" a woman's voice asked. "What's wrong?" She looked up to find herself staring at Sheriff Grant. The officer was looking at her with obvious concern. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but instead closed it and shook her head. The sheriff watched her for a moment before putting her arm around her shoulders and moving her out of the way of the crowd. Jenny had apparently been waiting for her wife near one of the food carts. Sheriff Grant led Sarah over to where she was standing. Both women were now looking at her in concern, and she felt her face growing warm with embarrassment. "What's going on?" Jenny asked, looking back and forth between Sheriff Grant and Sarah. "I'm not sure," Sheriff Grant replied. "Are you all right, Sarah? Did something happen? Where's Josh?" "I don't give a shit where Josh is," Sarah growled as she crossed her arms. "Sarah, this is very important. Did Josh hurt you?" "What?" Sarah blinked in confusion. "No, of course not. He's just acting like a dick." "Oh." Sheriff Grant and Jenny exchanged a look. For some reason, that made Sarah feel slightly ashamed. She had worried them for no real reason. She forced herself to smile. "I'm fine," Sarah said. "Thank you for your concern. I'm just going to head home. I'm sorry if I worried you." "I'll tell you what," Jenny said. "Why don't you let me give you a ride home instead?" "It's okay. I left my bike at the split log." "We can pick it up on the way." Jenny smiled slightly. "Come on. You'd be doing me a favor by getting me away from all this carnival food. I'm well on my way to making myself sick for a month." Sarah snorted. "Yeah, okay. Thanks. I'll be back in a bit, Maggie. Try not to have all the fun without me." "Hey, no guarantees," Sheriff Grant replied. Sarah glanced over at Jenny as they went back out the carnival's front gate. She and her father had gone over to the Grant house a number of times since moving to Lamplight Woods. While Sheriff Grant was friendly, she always carried an aura of authority with her that made her seem a bit unapproachable. Jenny, however, was always pleasant and open. They didn't say anything as they crossed the field. The sun was all the way down now, and the only light was what the carnival was producing behind them and the street lamps up ahead. When they reached the bridge leading over the river, the woman stopped and leaned against the stone railing. "I'm not going to ask you about what happened," Jenny assured her. "It's not my business. With that said, I'm now going to ask you another question that is also not my business, so I want you to know that I'm fully aware of my hypocrisy." "All right," Sarah said. "What's your question?" "Do you really want to leave? Or do you actually want to go back in there and tell your best friend to stop acting like an asshole?"